Welcome everybody. Very excited to have you here in our next session, and really diving into the financial side with Perrin. Very excited to get going here. My name's Janina. I'm here from CareStack, and we're one of the sponsors this evening. And we also have Allison here from Darby. I will now turn it over to Perrin again. So sorry for that technical difficulty there.
Thank you very much, Janina. And let me make sure that I am able to share my screen. So hopefully that's coming through with everybody. Pop it into presentation mode. Really appreciate, Janina, you and Kelsey and all the friends we have at CareStack for putting this on, along with our partners at Darby, Allison and Andrea, Jeff, and the whole crew there. This has been a real fun series to do, and hopefully for the people who are in the audience, y'all have been along for the ride for the prior sessions. This is the 6th in a 7-part series. If this is the first time you've been on one of these webinars, I think the rest of them are stored in a video vault that you can go back and access, or you can send me or any of the panelists an email and we can get you connected to the prior sessions as well. As Janine and Allison said, my name is Perrin Desports. I am one of the co-founders of Polaris Healthcare Partners. I don't get any commercial support for any of these presentations, and all the subject matter is ours and ours alone. That's me, like I say, co-founder and partner at Polaris. My background is in the dental distribution space, and I launched a prior startup called Tusk Partners prior to leaving that business and launching Polaris about 2.5 years ago with my partner, DeWalker Sinha. At Polaris, we work with entrepreneurial dentists to build and ultimately exit successful group practice. All of our work, all of our focus is really exclusively in the group practice space. We don't really work too much with the private equity-backed groups, the enterprise-level DSOs, the name brands we all know and love, so to speak. We really don't work that often with traditional solo practices unless they'd like to build a group. All of our focus and all of the services, all the subject matter that we share is really focused exclusively on group dental practices. For those that may be new to this series, or maybe if you've never heard one of our or seen one of our presentations, I'll tell you that we get kind of granular and fairly detail oriented as it relates to the subject matter at hand. If you want to put your phone or tablet up to that QR code, much like you did for Janina, you can download a copy of this presentation by putting in your first name, last name, and email address. So I'll give you just a second to do that and access the landing page and then start your download. And that way you can go back and look at any of the slides again for yourself or use it as a bit of reference material. In case you missed it, there'll be another QR code at the end to be able to download that a second time. So I think that we're sort of at an industry inflection point, and I don't mean that right now driven by the rise in interest rates. That's a relatively recent phenomenon, but one that will hopefully be somewhat temporary in nature, or at least will normalize soon. When I say an inflection point, dentistry is going through a wave of consolidation. You've probably all heard that before. It's not anything new or unusual, and it's happened in other healthcare verticals. But one of the questions that I get quite often, speaking in front of groups, doing presentations like this, or even taking one-on-one calls, is something around the lines of, hey, Perrin, do you think it's too late? Meaning, I'm interested in building a group practice. I don't know if I should do it, but have I missed the boat? And I would say no, that you haven't. If you're committed to building a group practice, there's still ample runway and ample opportunity to create economies of scale and ultimately to build a business that's not dependent upon you and your clinical skill set exclusively for its existence. The emerging and doctor-led group practice space, call it 2 to 10 locations, is still the fastest growing segment in all of dentistry. When we think of group practices, we think of private equity-backed DSOs, and they are huge businesses, multiple states, multiple hundred locations, and they're really large enterprises, and most of them have very good name brand recognition and reputation. That being said, the doctor-led groups that are using bank funds to grow are the most dynamic segment of the space, and more of them are popping up seemingly every week. So I think there's ample opportunity to build a successful business. You don't have to build a business that's 100 locations. Quite the contrary, you can build one that's 4 or 5 or 6 locations and have a wonderful business that cash flows unbelievably well. So should you do it or should you not? And that's really the question that this entire webinar series is oriented toward, giving you some tools and tips and understanding about how to contemplate that. I love adding this Chinese proverb to presentations like this because it says the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is right now. And that's sort of the mindset that you have to have. Yeah, if you had started building a group practice 20 years ago, you'd be a lot further along. You know, you may have sold it, or you may have partnered with a private equity group and taken some chips off the table. But if you haven't started, you still have an ample runway to create a business of whatever size and scale and magnitude that you would like. And today is a great day to do that. So we're going to talk a lot about banking because this is really what I call the Achilles heel of every group practice. And I'm going to explain to you why that is. But before I do, I might ask Kelsey to ask a little poll question of the audience and see if we can get a little bit of audience participation feedback. Kelsey?
Yep, I just launched it, so we'll leave that up for a couple seconds here. The question is, how many banks do you currently work with?
Eager to kind of see what our results are on this one. The context of the question is, if you do have multiple locations, how many of them are funded by different banks, essentially?
Perfect. I'll give you guys 5 more seconds here because I'm seeing they're slowing down. All right, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Does everybody see that? We see that on your side?
Yeah, okay. Obviously, we got some people who are just starting out if they're not working with a bank at all. A good number are working with only one bank, which is a good sign. There are a healthy number that are 2 and 3 or more. So good stuff, good information, and we'll dig into a little bit more of that as we roll through this. So, like I say, our work at Polaris focuses on a segment of the group practice space we call doctor-founded and debt-funded. Doctor-founded and debt-funded. And what that means is that the groups we work with are the entrepreneurs who happen to be dentists, and they want to own more than one location, and they're using bank funds to grow. And bank funds, even in a rising rate environment, are without a doubt the right funding solution for an emerging group practice. Private equity groups certainly have their place, but it's not until a lot further up the food chain. And you know, the work that we do, we tend to see how people get the banking opportunity wrong. And if you make a mistake in this particular arena, it can definitely bring a growing group practice to its knees. So it really doesn't matter what your growth strategy is if the bank won't fund it. If your goal is going to be to build a group practice of 3 or 4 or 5 locations maybe, and you're going to take an extended period of time to do that, say 8 to 10 years, you can probably do it with the lender you're working with presently. And the reason for that is because you're paying down the principal of the loans on your existing practice or practices. And as you do that, the bank develops more of a track record with you and to a degree, a greater level of security with you. So if your growth strategy is one that is more slower paced or methodical, I might call it, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that, then the lender that you're working with presently, any of the lenders that we all know and love, is probably a fine solution to get you where you want to go if it's 3 or 4 locations over a 10-year period. On the other hand, a lot of the entrepreneurs we work with have a faster paced growth strategy, and they want to acquire 1 or possibly 2 and sometimes even 3 practices per year, each year for the next 5 to 10 years. Build a business that might be somewhere on the smaller side, 10 to 12 locations, on the bigger side, maybe 25 to 30 locations. And if that's your goal, and if you're going to use bank funds to do it, you absolutely have to be partnered with the right lending institution that will agree to fund your future growth strategy. The bank that will agree to fund your future growth strategy. That's critically important because most of the retail lenders that you're probably working with and those that you've worked with in the past are not going to be the bank to take you the distance if your intention is to grow that quickly. So banks are inherently risk averse, and all of you who are licensed dentists are a wonderful credit profile from a lending context. Dentists hardly ever default. You're one of the lowest credit rate risks in the entire world of banking. And that's because you are usually personally guaranteeing the loan. You are always in the practice 4 to 5 days a week. You are usually the largest clinical producer and largest economic engine in that business. You're personally guaranteeing the loans and you got your fingers on just about anything. And so that is a really, really low credit risk profile from a banking standpoint. So it doesn't cost a bank a lot of money to underwrite the viability of your loan. And for that reason, dentists usually get very, very low interest rates. The default rate risk is, it's not zero, but it ain't much above that. When you start looking to borrow more money and buy more locations, and you can't be in every location at the same point in time, you can't be in 2 places at once, and you're taking on more debt to acquire practices, and then there's a challenge around integrating those practices and operating those businesses, and you have associates working in different locations. Well, now the credit profile changes a little bit, and you are more of a risk of default because oftentimes you can have one practice that's performing really well, and it's actually funding the practices that are underperforming. And as you add additional locations, the credit risk profile from you as a borrower tends to go up. And we see that reflected in higher interest rates for those building group practices. That's normal, it's predictable, and it's understandable because we see more defaults in a group practice space than we do in a solo space. So what we call retail lenders, the lenders that are essentially a really low rate over typically a 10-year term, are very prolific. You all know national lenders, regional lenders, local and municipal lenders. Everybody loves lending money to dentists, again, because you don't default. But they're all basically offering the same rate and term, and they have the same limited, what we call credit box. Most of those are credit boxes that are going to max out around $2 million in total loan exposure. So if it costs you $800,000 to $1 million to buy or build your first practice, and you're going to go out and buy another practice that is about the same size and volume, you're probably going to bump up against the credit box limitations of that particular bank you're working with. And they're probably not going to loan you money to buy your third location until you've taken a while to pay down the existing principal in your prior 2 loans. Whenever you hear a relationship manager say something to the effect of, "Doc, we're a multi-billion-dollar bank. We have more money than you could ever spend," that person is the relationship manager for the bank. They don't make lending decisions. Credit officers do. Credit officers won't give you a commitment in writing unless they know they can fund it because they're obligated to. That's a lending commitment in writing. So if you're talking to your relationship manager about, "Hey, will y'all loan me more money to buy locations 4, 5, and 6, the relationship officer can tell you anything that they want, but they're not legally bound to do it. All right. So what you want to understand is what your business plan is. How quickly do you want to grow and add locations? Is your current lender willing and able to do that at the pace you want to do it, and at the forecasted total loan exposure amount that you predict you're going to end up at?" And a lot of them won't give that to you in writing because they're not committed to it. So here's a scenario that we typically see. You start out in practices 1, 2, and possibly 3 with one of the national lenders that we all know and love. Pretty cheap interest rate, about 4.5%. prepayment penalty structure is that you can't prepay it in the first 2 years, and then it's a 3-2-1 thereafter. And that lender is in first lien position. But you don't want to stop at 3 locations. You want to go and build a bigger business and continue your growth strategy. But that bank says, hey, we're about maxed out at 3 locations. We're not going to loan you any more money right now. So what's the answer? Well, you don't want to stop growing, and you don't want to wait to pay down those loans over a number of years and then buy practices in a second wave. You want to keep going. There's probably opportunity in your marketplace. So what you say is, well, if my primary bank, the bank I've worked with up to this point, isn't going to loan me any more money, I'll just go to another bank that'll fund locations 4 and 5, maybe a regional bank. Now, this bank is going to be in second position and only tied to locations 4 and 5. So their rate's going to be a little bit higher, maybe a point higher at 5.5%. And the prepayment penalty is going to be 5%, 4%, 3, 2, and 1 of usually the original loan amount. But you don't want to stop at 5 locations. You'd like to grow bigger still, and you think you have the opportunity to do that by acquiring locations 6 and 7. But that regional bank you worked with on locations 4 and 5 also taps out and says, we're not going to loan you any more money at this point. So maybe you look at a municipal or an SBA type of lender. This is going to be a bank that's going to be in third position, probably a little bit higher rate. And again, prepayment penalty is probably something akin to 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. What you're looking at in front of you in this grid is something that we see all too often. It's 7 locations funded by 3 or more banks, and it's a convoluted cost of capital structure. And it's really what I call musical banks, because the music runs out eventually to where there's not going to be a lending institution that's willing to take on a further subordinated position due to the risk profile and their queue in line of receivership position. So you literally run out of potential lenders before you've probably built the business that you wanted to. This is a terrible way to build a business. It will get you into a lot of trouble, and ultimately it limits the size or the pace of the business that you can build. So here's another bad scenario that we sometimes see. When you hit a limit with your primary bank, you decide that you're going to bring on an associate in this next location, and you're going to partner with them. You're going to provide the back-end resources, the brand, the systems and the processes, and everything else to make this location be successful. But that partner is going to personally guarantee the loan on that location. Maybe it's you and your partner that founded the business are going to be a 1/3 each, and this associate who's going to guarantee the loan on this upcoming location is going to be your 1/3 partner there too. So you and your partner are going to provide all the brand, the administrative services, the recruiting, the systems and processes, all the secret sauce to make the group practice be viable and profitable. But the associate is going to be the one that's actually going to sign on the note. So that ought to solve your funding issue, right? It won't. Both of those scenarios expose you to a potential lawsuit. And a lot of you in the audience tonight, probably if you have multiple locations with multiple banks, you're probably not aware of this, and this ought to perk your ears up, I hope. Most loans have something called a negative debt covenant or a subordinated debt covenant. And what that covenant says is that you, as the personal guarantor on the primary loan, cannot acquire another business asset without your primary lender's consent. And you can't take on more debt to do it, more importantly. So that second scenario, the third that I spoke about in terms of the third associate partner personally guaranteeing the loan, yeah, they're going to personally guarantee the loan, but your business is going to be in a corporate guarantor position. And even if you're not required to do that by that secondary bank, when your primary bank does an annual lien update, it's going to reveal the guarantor status, the cross-collateralization of it. And that's where your primary lender can call in your loan. They probably don't want to if you're paying the loan in good standing and on time and everything. The bank doesn't want to own your business. They have really no use for a dental practice. They would rather you own it and make the payments on schedule, but they also don't want to increase the risk of you going belly up and basically defaulting on the entire house of cards. At a minimum here, if they do call your loan, you're going to spend a lot of money and you're going to waste a lot of time with attorneys getting this scenario rectified. It is an altogether avoidable situation that most people don't understand is a ticking time bomb in their business, and it will absolutely bring your growth strategy to its knees if the primary lender calls it in. Don't do this. Understand that whether or not you have a subordinated debt covenant or a negative debt covenant in your existing loans, that's the first thing. And the second thing is, if you are going to build a multi-location group, find the one lender that will fund the whole thing over a period of years, looking ahead to the practices that you want to buy or build. If you're relying on finding the practice to acquire and then figuring out the funding piece of it, you're doing it all wrong. You basically are going to run out of capital sources due to that subordinated debt risk that I mentioned before, and it's going to grind your growth strategy to a halt. It would be better if you were able to find the one lender that will look at you and your entire business from a guarantor relationship and agree to fund the whole thing from something called a global debt service coverage ratio into account. So here's what some of this looks like in terms of compare and contrast. I mentioned retail lenders, they're the name brands we all know and love in terms of banks. But when you really want to build a group practice, you're going to start migrating into something called business-to-business banking that's known as lower middle market lending or true middle market lending. This is true business-to-business banking. It's usually traditional banks. It could be non-bank lenders and it could be mezzanine debt structures, but that's way, way up the food chain. When you're one location, you're working in that location 3 to 4 to 5 days a week. Your primary role is that of clinician. Like I mentioned before, you're the largest economic engine in that business. When the bank looks at you, they see a very, very low credit default rate risk. And they use something called debt service coverage ratio to make loan determinations and approvals. Usually that amount is going to be somewhere around 85% of the revenue of the business you're looking to acquire. And you can take on a loan for the business as well as some amount of working capital. Term of the loan and amortization schedule is usually 10-year on both. These, when I put this deck together, it was a while back. Rates are up now, but they're probably going to be in the 5.5 to 6.5 range is my guess right now. Your primary focus is generating free cash flow or income for your family. And to add additional locations is going to require you to file another application to add those additional locations. This credit facility never renews from your primary lender. And like I say, it taps out probably around $2 million in total loan exposure. If you want to build a group practice, something like 4 locations, more than likely you're going to be in a more limited clinical role. You're probably going to be working about 2 days per week, but not in the same location every time. And your role is going to be multifaceted. You're going to be the CEO of the business, you're certainly practicing clinically still, but you're also going to be in charge of business development, meaning finding more locations to acquire. The default rate risk is much greater to the bank in this scenario, and they use several different ratios to determine creditworthiness and to grant approval. Debt service coverage ratio is one of them, as well as what we call funded debt to EBITDA or debt to EBITDA. We'll talk about that in a little bit in a second. The amount of approval is somewhere usually around 65% of revenue, and it's dependent upon free cash flow. You could have some level of debt recapitalization in a loan package, as well as working capital, as well as a credit facility. And I'm going to talk about what that looks like, because just like you and I think about a home equity line of credit or a credit limit on our credit card, this is much the same thing, but it's a credit limit that allows you to go out and acquire other practices. term and AM schedules could be something as low as 5 to 7 years, or something along the line of 7 to 10 years, depending on what your cash on balance sheet needs are and some of the other dynamics of the business. Rate's going to be a little bit higher because the default rate risk is higher, so you should expect to pay probably 100 to 200 basis points more for this type of a loan commitment. Your focus here is not necessarily as much on income as it is on creating wealth, and that's equity on balance sheet. The other key to this is that line of credit that I mentioned earlier, if you continue to operate the business in a financially viable way according to the terms of the loan, that credit facility will refresh usually every year. And that is sometimes as much as every 6 months. And that is a really nice thing to have, knowing that you have a secure funding commitment in place that allows you to go out and buy or build more locations when you find the right ones to pull the trigger on. And usually you can get the approval to do that within less than a month's time. So you can close really quickly with a credit facility in place. Maximum loan exposure for lower middle markets, probably around 25 million in total debt. Middle markets up to about 100 million. And then obviously looking at institutional lenders, you're well over $1 billion. So this is a structure that in theory you should never outgrow. And for those that do follow the dynamics of the industry, you'll know that one of the largest enterprise level DSOs, Pacific Dental Services, is still privately held, meaning not private equity backed. And this is the type of the way that they use debt funding to continue to execute their growth strategy. So really the only solution for a growing group is working with one lender that has a credit facility or a guidance facility for growth. And a guidance facility for you means knowing that you have the purchasing power that's committed to you ahead of time that allows you to go out and acquire the practices that you want to. It would be like going to a department store or a grocery store and filling up your shopping cart full of everything that you wanted, getting in line to check out, and then having to call your bank to figure out how much money you can buy. I mean, you would never do that, right? You would have a credit card and you'd know your credit limit. You'd roughly know the amount of the balance you have on there, and you know what your spending power is. And that is akin to having a credit facility from a lower middle market or a middle market lender. It's your hunting license. It's the credit limit. It's the line of credit that allows you to go out and buy more practices. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples on some structures that we've been able to negotiate for clients in the past, just so you can see what some of this looks like. This was a multi-owner general dentistry group. They were looking to refinance a number of loans while they merged some businesses in. They needed a little bit of working capital, and they obviously wanted a guidance line or a credit facility to go out and acquire more practices. Or actually, they were building them. It was a de novo strategy. So there is some level of both personal guarantee and corporate guarantee. The committed term loan in this case was a term loan to refinance all of the existing debt, about $6.5 million, a guidance line of $1.5 million to acquire more practices, and that working capital line of about $500,000 in a revolver. So this was a structure that allowed them to merge practices together and still have a commitment for a growth strategy to build out the next phase of the business. Obviously, the guidance line, the credit facility, is subject to approval by the bank. And it outlines here the way they go about making those approvals and what the data is they need to collect in order to get the approval. This is really understanding the details and the rules of the game. Banking is kind of an opaque process for far too many people. And when your growth strategy is dependent upon somebody agreeing to fund it, you would really rather know how the game is played. And this is a structure, a term sheet that outlines exactly how the bank is going to review things and grant you that approval. It also wants to have some level of what's known as pro forma compliance of loan covenants, meaning after you acquire this practice, we want to know that your business, the way it sits right here, right now today, plus this next edition, is still going to be in compliance with the parameters outlined in the loan covenants. So term and AM schedules, this was one where it was going to be principal plus interest over a 10-year period or 10-year AM on a 5-year period, excuse me, whereas the guidance line was going to be a 12-month interest-only draw period since it was a de novo strategy, and then a 10-year AM schedule beyond that. This offers you a lot of flexibility depending on how you plan to deploy the funds. And if most people grow practices through acquisition, but more and more are doing de novos now. And de novo is a different type of a strategy. It takes a little longer to bake, and you would like not to have the pressure of principal plus interest payments in the early stages of that practice coming out of the ground. So based on what your growth strategy is, we can often negotiate the right structure that meets the business needs on a forward-looking basis. Financial covenants toward the bottom, minimum debt service coverage ratio, 1.25 times debt to EBITDA, tested semi-annually, meaning every 6 months, and a max total debt leverage of 3.75 tested every 6 months as well. So this thing refreshes on a much more frequent basis, which is great for the borrower. Here's that limitation on additional indebtedness without consent. That's the negative debt covenant structure. And then what are the reporting requirements? Because all of these have a different amount of cost when it comes to working with your accounting firm. CPA audited financial statements at the end of every fiscal year. And then you can see the others, their semi-annual reporting structures required there. So the critical point to this, and I use this one that was a de novo strategy to kind of illustrate the point, is you really want to balance your term and AM schedules and understand principal plus interest or interest only, and that balances cash flow needs of the business against cash on balance sheet for the business. And this is one where you really want to understand the growth strategy that you intend to deploy, and you want to match up the loan structure that'll complement all of that. Ideally, you should never be able to outgrow this type of funding. So here's a working example of what one might look like. This is what we typically see. The first scenario is acquiring one practice per year with a traditional rate and term lender that's at a 5% rate. Pretty normal. Again, this deck was built a while back, so the rates are somewhat historical. You can see that over a 5-year period, acquiring one practice per year, we max out at a little bit over $2 million in total loan exposure, total debt. You can see the amount of the debt payments each year, and you can see our aggregated coverage ratio and the debt to EBITDA ratio on the far right-hand side. This is a business that if we were able to build it and we decided to take it to market with about $1.6 to $1.7 million in EBITDA, it would probably fetch about 6 times EBITDA on the market, maybe a little bit higher. So you got 10 million in valuation, transact the business, you pay off debt and taxes, and you have about $5.6 million in total net proceeds. When we look at that same exact scenario, but we map it out with a 7% rate instead of a 5% rate, you can see that now we're a little bit north of 2.2 million in total debt. And along the same lines, if we took the business to market and sold it, the net proceeds would be a little bit over 5.6 million here. So the valuation outcome in these scenarios is all but the same. The rate doesn't make a whole lot of difference. And when people get wrapped around the axle on a 5% rate or a 7% rate or 4.5 versus 5.25, you're focused on the wrong number. Because if there's a limitation based on that rate that impacts the business you want to build, it doesn't matter what the rate is. You can't build the business that you want because the funding commitment isn't there. So let's take a look at that same scenario, that one practice per year at a 5% rate that I just went through, And let's say that this lender at this loaning us money at 7% allows us to buy more than one location per year. Here is where we can take on a lot more debt to the tune of almost $5 million over the same period of time. Our debt to EBITDA ratios are still within range. We can build a much more valuable business because it's generating a higher volume of EBITDA. Now, when we take that business to market, it values more highly, and the net proceeds to us upon the sale are significantly greater. So the right bank, the right lender is really a matter of the business you intend to build. And just because you have a great relationship with the bank you started with doesn't mean that they're going to continue to fund your growth strategy forever. If you got a really, really low rate from them in the beginning, the chances of them funding your growth strategy, if you want to build 5 to 6 to 10 or more locations, the likelihood of them funding that is frankly not very high. So you want to evaluate your lending relationships and understand whether or not it aligns or competes with your vision for growth of the business overall. That's in terms of how it stacks up with the cap table and equity, if you have multiple owners, certainly, roles and responsibilities, and certainly the debt structure of the business. So here are a couple of key takeaways. I mentioned before that I get asked that question around, should I or should I not build a group practice? Have I missed the boat? You know, am I too late? And I said, no, if you want to build a group, you have ample opportunity to do that. When it comes to you individually, it's a little bit of a different scenario. If you are, a couple of years from retirement, I don't know if it's going to be worth the risk for you to take on all this debt to build a group practice. I don't believe that building a group practice is the right thing for everybody. I mean, quite the contrary. I know that it's not. Unfortunately, in my world, I get to see underperforming businesses. I'll try to be diplomatic. Ones that don't cash flow very well, where the founder and the owner is carrying a high debt burden and a lot of stress, and it's not easy. So just because everybody else is doing it doesn't mean that you should do it too. And if you're 5 years or less from retirement, the likelihood is that you shouldn't. I don't think you have enough time based to allow the growth strategy to take hold and for it really to pay off. On the other hand, if you're 10 years or more from retirement, I think you got to consider it, because the dynamics around owning a successful solo practice for the next 10 to 20 years are also getting to be incredibly challenging. The ADA has released a lot of statistics lately, and maybe you've seen it on social media or otherwise, where they talked about how costs have increased by about 7.7% over the last handful of years, yet revenues only increased about 2.2%. And that margin compression hits every solo practice owner right in their wallet. And if you're operating a solo practice, you don't have a whole lot of negotiating power. You're not generating enough cash flow to make massive reinvestments in the business and marketing, technology, continuing ed, or otherwise. And it gets to be a really challenging business to run. Some of those characteristics in a manageable group practice of 3 to 5 locations are a significantly different dynamic. So if you've got more than 10 years to go before retirement, I think you need to consider building a group practice. And when I say building a group practice, I don't mean building one that's 100 locations. You can build a perfectly great business in 3 to 5 locations or thereabouts and be perfectly happy and very well compensated for it. So some key takeaways here is that a future funding commitment truly is worth a couple of hundred basis points if they agree to fund your strategy into the next phase of growth. You always want to model out your pro forma debt leverage, free cash flow, and valuation outcomes. Those 3 things are critically important to understand the amount of debt you intend to take on based on what your growth strategy is. The same thing can be said, hey, if you decide to do that and acquire all these practices, are they going to generate the free cash flow necessary to cover debt service payments and to also put some more cash in your back pocket? And what's the value of the business that you're creating along the way? The first step to getting somewhere is simply deciding that you're not going to stay where you are right now. It's a great quote from JP Morgan. And if building a group practice is the right next step for you, hopefully I've given you some things to think about tonight and some ways to approach some of that. For those that were tuning in for the continuing ed credits, that is the verification code. My first name, Perrin, Perrin, 2023 thereafter. I'll leave that up on the screen for just a second so you can take it down and redeem it for your credits. And I think we're going to be ending up a little bit early tonight. If you like this type of information and you want to learn more about group practices, we have a lot of free educational resources to share. Our podcast is called Group Practice Accelerator. You can find it on all the major outlets, and we usually drop a new episode 1 to 2 times a week, and there's ample wonky business subject matter on there that you can do a deep dive on all of it. We've got well over 100 episodes over the last 2 years. Webinars like this one, there's also a news feed that you can subscribe to and view some of the videos on our YouTube page and others. And if you got questions about anything, you can book a call directly with me off of our website. In terms of what all we do, we offer a variety of services, associate partnership structures, certainly growth capital solutions, strategic consulting for growth strategy, and sell-side advisory if you're looking to exit your business. But if you're looking to build a group practice and you don't know what you don't know and you're not really sure where to start, a discovery day session is one-on-one with one of our advisors. I teach about 50% of them. It's a 7-hour day together, and we cover a lot of the fundamentals of group practices. But because it's one-on-one, we get to go, dive deep down rabbit holes on whatever is, most near and dear to you. And obviously, we get a lot of nice compliments on those sessions together. So I encourage you to consider that if you're thinking about building a group practice. You're not sure if you want to build one and you're not sure about next steps, and maybe you got some questions to answer. In a 7-hour day together, we can cover a lot of ground together. So you might want to inquire about that. The last webinar in our series, and I failed to look up the date, is going to be on exit strategies and the time frame that it usually takes to get there. So this is all about the lead up to selling your business, the process of selling a business, and a lot about deal structure. And that is actually going to be on Wednesday, September the 20th at 7 p.m. Eastern. So I hope you'll be able to join us then. And if you want to learn more about this type of subject matter, you might also want to consider joining us for a 2-day seminar called Scaling from Clinician to CEO. This is the second year in a row we've done this with Dr. Mark Costas and his team at the Dental Success Institute. It's going to be in Scottsdale, Arizona, October 11th through 13th. There's a QR code that you can scan for more information there. And if you like this type of education, you're going to get it through a fire hose over 2 days there. You can see some of the agenda on the right-hand side. We got a lot of great reviews on it last year when we hosted it in Denver. This year it'll be in Scottsdale. So hopefully you can make time to join us there if you'd like to do a deeper dive and total immersion for it. So I'm going to open it up to questions, Kelsey, if we have any, and I'll put the QR codes back up if anybody would like to download a copy of this presentation that may have joined us a little bit late in the beginning and missed the QR code, or if you'd like to book a call directly with me to talk about anything else, you can scan the QR code on the right-hand side. Any questions we got out there, Kelsey?
Yeah, I don't have any submitted right now. So if you're okay with it, maybe we can wrap up a little bit early. I did put the verification code for CE in the chat, so everyone can grab that if they'd like. And the link for your Scaling from Clinician to CEO event is in there as well. So yeah, Wonderful. If there are any questions, let's call it a night, I guess, right?
Yeah, okay, I think that sounds good. And I'll put one more. Well, I was going to say, okay, there we go. That's my, excuse me, that's my email address, Perrin@PolarisHealthcarePartners.com. if anybody would like to send me an email directly. You can find that also on the website and everything too. But really appreciate everybody joining us. Love the partnership we have with CareStack and with Darby. Looking forward to being with all of you ladies in Scottsdale in another roughly 2 months, and hopefully we'll get to meet some of the people in the audience there too. So thanks so much for joining us tonight. We'll see you in a month.
Have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you.